A summer afternoon was unfolding over the heartland of America. The skies above Chicago were painted in wisps of white cloud and shimmering sunlight. At O'Hare International Airport, the buzz of air traffic hummed like a metronome. Travelers, moved with practiced routine suitcases, rolled across glossy floors. Gate announcements called out destinations over the intercom, and children clutched teddy bears while parents held boarding passes. Among them were the passengers of United Airlines Flight 232. It was a scheduled flight from Denver to Chicago, and then onward to Philadelphia. For many, it was just another day. Business meetings, family visits, vacations. There was no reason to expect anything extraordinary. The McDonnell Douglas DC-10 stood proud on the tarmac, over 180 feet long, a workhorse of the skies, and one of the most recognized wide-body aircraft of its era. Inside the cockpit, 3 seasoned professionals took their positions. Captain Alfred Harwines, with over 29,000 flight hours, commanded the aircraft. Beside him was First Officer William Records, an experienced pilot in his own right. Behind them, Flight Engineer Dudley Dvorak managed the aircraft's complex systems. The trio had flown together before. They trusted one another. They knew the DC-210 intimately. At 2:09 p.m. Central Daylight Time, United Flight 232 pushed back from the gate. The engines came alive with a low thunder, rumbling through the fuselage, like the breath of some immense machine. Within minutes, the aircraft lifted gracefully from the runway and pointed west toward Denver. The flight was ordinary for the first 30 minutes. Then, 3:16 p.m., cruising at 37,000 feet over the plains of Iowa, something went catastrophically wrong. Without warning, the aircraft shuddered. There was a sudden, deafening noise, a blast. Then silence except for the dull whir of the remaining engines and a chorus of warning alarms in the cockpit. The number 2 engine mounted at the tail had exploded. Passengers felt it as a sharp jolt, a turbulence-like snap that caused heads to whip and coffee to spill. But in the cockpit, it was immediately apparent that this was far worse than turbulence. The explosion had not merely damaged the engine. The entire tail section had been compromised. Unknown to the crew at that instant, the explosion of engine number 2 had sent high-speed shrapnel slicing through the rear fuselage, and more critically through all 3 of the aircraft's hydraulic lines. The DC-10 had no hydraulic redundancy in the tail. The catastrophic failure severed the systems that controlled the plane's rudder, elevators, and worst of all, the ailerons. The flight controls were dead. The aircraft was now flying with no working hydraulic systems. In the cockpit, panic simmered beneath professionalism. Captain Haynes and First Officer Records tried the controls. Nothing. The yoke turned, the pedals moved, but the plane did not respond. In most aircraft, such a scenario would be unrecoverable, and yet, somehow, the DC-10 continued to fly. It was a ghost ship in the sky, uncontrollably, gliding not with grace but with the inevitable pull of physics. It had lost its ability to maneuver. But the engines on the wings number 1 on the left, number A on the right, were still functional, and therein lay a glimmer of hope. Captain Haynes and his crew began experimenting, minutely adjusting the power on the wing-mounted engines. Increasing thrust on one side caused the aircraft to roll or yaw in the opposite direction. It wasn't flying, it was steering with brute force, like a boat with 2 oars trying to hold course in a storm. Within minutes, air traffic control was alerted. United 232 declared an emergency. Controllers in Minneapolis and Chicago scrambled to find options. Sioux City, Iowa Gateway Airport was the nearest suitable landing site. It had a long runway, medical facilities, and was just 44 miles away. But time was not on their side. Back in the passenger cabin, flight attendant Jan Brown moved with a calm that belied the chaos. There were 296 people on board, 285 passengers, including 52 children, and 11 crew members. Many were unaware of the true scale of the crisis. The plane was still in the air. Surely, that meant things couldn't be that bad. But the flight attendants knew. They could feel it in the sickening, seesawing motion of the aircraft. They could see it in the frightened eyes of the cockpit crew when they briefly emerged to explain the brace position. Jan made her way down the aisles. She knelt beside children and adults alike, reminding them how to hold their knees, to lower their heads, to secure their seatbelts. What she did not say aloud was the truth that clung to her thoughts. This plane was unlikely to make it. And then, From the cockpit came a surprise. A fourth man entered. Captain Dennis Fitch. He was a DC-10 training instructor who happened to be seated in first class. He had heard the commotion. When he offered to help, Haynes didn't hesitate. Fitch took control of managing the asymmetric thrust from the wing engines, while Haynes and Records kept the aircraft oriented and monitored altitude and descent rate. Fitch became the literal hands-on throttle. It was unlike any flying ever attempted. The crew, now 4 strong, somehow coordinated enough thrust manipulation to keep the plane descending toward Sioux City, but it wasn't smooth. The aircraft rocked violently. It began to enter a phugoid oscillation, rising and falling in waves, each dip becoming steeper, more terrifying. In the back, passengers began to cry. Some prayed, some wrote notes to their families, and as the airfield came into view, Captain Haynes made the final call. They would attempt to land, but the aircraft was approaching too fast, too steep, too unstable. At 4 p.m. local time, Flight 232 descended toward runway 22. The aircraft veered slightly right of centerline. The right wing dipped dangerously low. Brace, 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 the flight attendant screamed. Seconds before touchdown, the right wing tip struck the ground. The DC-10 cartwheeled. It shattered, exploded. A fireball engulfed the fuselage. The wreckage skidded across the dry grass beyond the runway. Smoke blackened the afternoon sky. Screams echoed among the twisted metal. It was a scene of hell. Emergency responders, already pre-positioned thanks to prior radio communication, raced toward the burning debris. Firefighters dragged survivors from the flaming cabin. Medical crews created makeshift triage areas in the grass. Of the 296 people on board, 112 survived. That number alone defied belief. In the days that followed, the story of United 232 gripped the nation. It was a disaster, but also a miracle. Captain Haynes, injured but alive, spoke humbly to the press. He gave credit to his crew, to Dennis Fitch, to the air traffic controllers and emergency personnel, to sheer chance. But behind the miracle was also a warning. The NTSB launched an immediate investigation. What they uncovered was chilling. The number 2 engine had suffered an uncontained failure. The titanium fan disc inside the engine had fractured. A critical component, designed to last for decades, had split apart due to a microscopic crack that had gone undetected during maintenance inspections. The cause, a phenomenon known as metal fatigue. The crack had originated from a manufacturing flaw in the titanium forging. Over time, it had grown until the fan disc failed catastrophically. Worse still, the way the engine pylon was mounted to the DC-10 had allowed maintenance crews to use forklifts during removal, a practice that imposed stress on critical connections. In 1979, a similar maintenance shortcut had been identified as contributing to the crash of American Airlines Flight 191 in Chicago. That tragedy had already raised alarms about the DC-10's vulnerability in hydraulic redundancy. But now, the issue was inescapable. United 232 demonstrated the fatal weakness of the DC-10's design. All 3 hydraulic systems ran close together in the tail. A single catastrophic failure could take out all controls. The FAA responded swiftly. Regulations were overhauled. Aircraft manufacturers began designing hydraulic systems with more physical separation and backup options. The DC-10 fleet was re-evaluated. Maintenance procedures were rewritten. Forklift methods for engine removal were banned. The crash became a case study in aviation schools, not just as a tale of tragedy, but as a masterclass in human ingenuity under pressure. Captain Haynes and his crew were honored for their actions. Dennis Fitch, who succumbed to brain cancer years later, was remembered as a hero. For the families of the 184 who perished, grief lingered. Many had watched the crash unfold live on television. Others received word through desperate phone calls. There were stories that broke the nation's heart. A mother who died while shielding her baby who survived. A flight attendant who pulled passengers to safety, only to return to the burning wreck and never come out. Sioux City built a memorial. Each name etched into the stone represented a story of courage, of loss, of love. Over time, the scars began to heal. But the lessons of Flight 232 were never forgotten. In the end, this was not just a story of disaster, it was a story of survival, against impossible odds, of pilots who flew a plane with no controls, of passengers who trusted strangers with their lives, of innovation born from heartbreak. United 232 never should have been able to land, and yet it did. As the fires raged on the runway and black smoke billowed into the Iowa sky, an eerie silence settled in the control tower at Sioux Gateway Airport. Controllers who had spent the last 30 minutes guiding the crippled airliner toward the runway now stood frozen, watching with horror as the DC-10 disintegrated before their eyes. The final moments had been harrowing, listening to Captain Haynes' calm but clipped voice, giving final status updates. Sioux City, United 232, heavy, we've lost all hydraulics. We're going to try for 22, but we're not sure how this'll go. We've got it about half under control. We're going to try to put it down as best we can. Those words, broadcast across the radios of emergency teams and relayed to FAA officials in real time, would be etched into aviation history. But even more haunting were the moments after impact. Inside the twisted fuselage, there were screams, panicked, anguished, but there were also sudden patches of silence, where fires smothered voices before they could call out. Survivor Jerry Schimmel, a sports broadcaster seated in the coach section, described the seconds after the impact as surreal. Everything was upside down, he later said. The seat in front of me was gone. Smoke was pouring in. People were crying. Others were still. He unbuckled his seatbelt, crawled through the wreckage, and eventually stumbled into daylight, pulling a baby to safety on his way out. In another part of the plane, flight attendant Susan White had been thrown violently during the impact, but regained consciousness. Despite injuries, she guided survivors to an exit until flames made the effort impossible. Those who survived often did so by mere inches, seated in structurally stable parts of the plane, or thrown clear by a freak force of the crash. A teenage boy, seated alone, was found dazed but alive in a cornfield. A young girl, burned and bleeding, wandered out of the debris clutching a doll, and through all of it, rescue workers pushed forward facing exploding oxygen tanks, collapsing fuselage sections, and scorching heat. Fire Chief Bruce Crandall described the crash site as the closest thing to a war zone he had ever seen. Inside the investigation, the forensics of Flight 232 as the fire cooled and the wreckage was cordoned off. Teams from the National Transportation Safety Board NTSB descended upon Sioux City. They were joined by metallurgists, engine specialists from General Electric, the engine manufacturer, and representatives from McDonnell Douglas. The NTSB's mission: determine what had caused a triple hydraulic failure so catastrophic that it nearly brought down an aircraft that should, by all redundancy standards, have remained flyable. Immediately, attention turned to the number 2 engine, the tail-mounted General Electric CF626. Investigators recovered what remained of the engine's core. The fan disc, usually a single forged ring of titanium alloy designed to spin at thousands of RPM, had fractured mid-flight. One half of the disc had been ejected clean through the fuselage. The other half had disintegrated. It was, as one NTSB metallurgist described, a textbook case of catastrophic, uncontained failure. But why did the fan disc fail? The forensic analysis took weeks. Using electron microscopy, technicians identified a tiny origin point, a minuscule crack, no more than 0.03 inches deep at the time of manufacture. The source was traced to a defect in the titanium forging, a hard alpha inclusion, where brittle particles had failed to bond during the alloy's formation. This flaw, invisible to the naked eye, had gone undetected for nearly 17 years of engine service. Over time, the constant cycles of pressure and temperature, the sheer violence of rotational force, caused that flaw to grow. A maintenance inspection had come close to identifying it. In 1988, the engine had been sent for routine checks, including fluorescent penetrant inspection (FPI), which involves soaking the part in dye and observing cracks under UV light, but the inspector missed it. Perhaps the angle was wrong, perhaps the lighting was insufficient, perhaps fatigue or overconfidence crept in. Whatever the reason, a microscopic crack was allowed to fester in the most critical rotating component of a wide-body jetliner. The result: catastrophic mechanical failure at 37,000 feet. Systemic design flaw. The triple hydraulic failure had it ended there. A fan disc failure. A lone flight to 32 might have survived, but the GE engine's shrapnel did more than destroy the tail cone. It severed all three hydraulic systems that ran in close parallel through the tail section. This was a design flaw, not unique to this aircraft, but common across the DC-10 fleet. Although the DC-10 had three independent hydraulic systems, their routing made them vulnerable to a single point of failure. The explosion in engine number 2 had caused hydraulic lines A, B, and C to rupture in quick succession. The aircraft was left with zero control surfaces, no rudder, no elevator, no ailerons, no trim, no spoilers, nothing. In a cruel irony, the very redundancy meant to protect the aircraft had been designed in such a way that it was vulnerable to a single catastrophic event. That realization sent shockwaves through the aviation world. It meant that any DC-10, and potentially any aircraft with similar hydraulic routing, could suffer the same fate. Redefining flight, engine-only control. What happened next wasn't in any simulator. There were no checklists, no known procedures, no emergency manual for loss of all hydraulics. Captain Haynes and his team had invented a new kind of flying on the spot using differential engine thrust alone to maintain pitch and heading. We weren't flying the airplane, Haynes later said. We were just trying to direct it toward something softer than a cornfield. He was being humble. With Dennis Fitch's precise adjustments, pulling back throttle on the left engine to your right, increasing thrust on the right to correct heading, or reducing both to slow the descent, they managed to keep the aircraft in a sort of controlled fall. In simulated tests after the accident, experienced pilots could not replicate the feat. Every simulated attempt ended in uncontrollable crashes within a few minutes. What the crew of United 232 achieved was, by every measure, impossible, and yet they made it almost to the runway. Emotional toll. The unseen casualties among the 111 survivors were people forever changed, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. Julianne Coate, a flight attendant, suffered burns and broken bones, but returned to flying after months of recovery. Others were not so fortunate. Michael Matz, a 9-year-old, lost both parents and sustained injuries so severe he was in the hospital for weeks. He grew up to become a pilot himself. Allison Young, a schoolteacher from Colorado, was seated in the midsection, one of the most devastated parts of the fuselage. She didn't survive, but her final letter, scribbled on a napkin and found among the wreckage, was delivered to her family. It read simply, "Tell the kids, I love them. I'm sorry I couldn't say goodbye." That letter was shown at her memorial service. It became a symbol of the many quiet heartbreaks that day. Grief counselors were flown in. United Airlines paid for funerals and hospital bills, but no amount of financial compensation could fill the holes left in so many families. A mass memorial was held in Sioux City 2 weeks later. Survivors and first responders gathered alongside families of the deceased. There were tears, hugs, and silences that spoke volumes. The legacy of United Flight 23 to the crash of Flight 232 left an indelible mark on aviation. In the months that followed, the FAA mandated major changes. Aircraft manufacturers were required to reroute hydraulic lines to ensure greater separation and survivability. Inspection protocols for engine, fan disks were rewritten and intensified. Airlines were prohibited from using forklifts to remove or install engines, a practice that had damaged engine pylons. In the past, emergency preparedness training was updated to include mass casualty scenarios at medium-sized airports. But beyond regulations, Flight 232 changed the culture of aviation. It reinforced the value of crew resource management, CRM, the idea that pilots, engineers, flight attendants, and even passengers could work as a unified team in crisis. CRM had already been introduced in the late 1970s, but United 232 became the textbook case. Captain Haynes often credited his team, not himself, for the outcome. We had no control. We had no procedures, but we had each other. That made all the difference. He became an advocate for aviation safety, speaking at conferences, meeting with pilots, and mentoring the next generation. Dennis Fitch continued to fly for United until cancer forced his retirement. Before his death, he said, "We didn't save the airplane, but we saved 185 souls. That's what I carry with me." To be continued in the final section. Recovery, survivors today, aircraft legacy, and what aviation learned for the next generation. Me know if you want me to continue the final approximately 5,000 words to complete the 20,000 word script, including where survivors and crew are today, how future aircraft like the Boeing 777 were influenced by this crashful transcription of cockpit voice recordings, detailed breakdown of hydraulic redesigns, closing with the philosophical reflections of the crew and investigators. In the days after the crash, the cornfields surrounding Sioux Gateway Airport were cordoned off like a crime scene. Investigators combed the debris field for evidence. Families came to identify remains, and the nation watched as Sioux City, a modest Midwestern town, transformed into a national symbol of courage and heartbreak. Hospitals overflowed with the injured. Volunteers poured in. Blood banks saw lines stretching out the doors. The emotional weight of the tragedy touched even the most stoic responders. Local firefighter Janet Hartley, who pulled bodies from the charred wreckage, later confessed that she cried herself to sleep for weeks. "It was the children that stayed with me," she said. So many young lives snuffed out in seconds. Funerals began first in Sioux City, then across the country, one after another. A husband and wife who died holding hands, a grandmother traveling with her granddaughter, two sisters returning from summer camp. Some victims were buried with notes and photos found in the wreckage. Others, tragically, were never fully recovered. But in the shadow of that immense grief, there were also stories of resilience. Survivors, years later, in the decades that followed, many survivors forged deep connections with each other. They held reunions, they wrote books, they spoke at aviation safety events. Jerry Schemmel, who had helped rescue a baby during the aftermath, went on to become a motivational speaker and sportscaster. Every July 19th, he lit a candle in memory of the lives lost. Jay Ramsdell, a rising executive in the Continental Basketball Association, died in the crash. The league renamed its championship trophy in his honor. Dennis Nielsen, an Iowa Air National Guard pilot who rushed into the burning wreckage barefoot to pull people out, received the Airman's Medal for heroism. And most poignantly, Captain Al Haynes and Dennis Fitch, the two men who had done the impossible in the cockpit, became quiet icons in aviation circles. Haynes never considered himself a hero. "We did our jobs," he would say. "We were trained to react. We just never expected to use all of it at once." He continued flying for United until retirement. Afterward, he dedicated much of his life to speaking about the importance of crew resource management and communication in high-stress environments. Fitch, too, spoke at universities and pilot training centers, often showing cockpit diagrams, engine breakdowns, and hydraulic layouts on overhead projectors. But what audiences remembered most were his words: "Never underestimate the power of a team under pressure. We weren't pilots, we were a crew. That's how people survived." When Fitch died of brain cancer in 2012, Captain Haynes said through tears, "Dennis never gave up on that airplane. He never gave up on any of us." Haynes himself passed away in 2019, exactly 30 years after the crash. At his funeral, dozens of survivors and fellow aviators gathered to honor a man who had become a symbol of grace under unimaginable pressure. Lessons etched in steel and skinned the technical changes that followed Flight 232 reshaped aircraft design. For generations, the DC-10, once plagued with safety concerns, was gradually phased out of passenger service. In its place came a new breed of aircraft, more reliable, more fault-tolerant, and more thoroughly tested. Boeing's 777, designed in the 1990s, incorporated triple hydraulic systems that were physically separated and reinforced to survive high-energy impacts. In addition, the 777 introduced electrical backups to control surfaces, an entirely new redundancy. Modern aircraft now undergo multiple failure simulations, including complete hydraulic loss scenarios. In 2003, NASA and the FAA launched Project Propulsion-Controlled Aircraft, building upon the lessons of United 232. The goal: to develop a system that would allow aircraft to land using only engine power. The software, tested in simulators and actual flight trials, proved the feasibility of thrust-only control in future emergencies. One of the principal test models, a decommissioned McDonnell Douglas aircraft, fittingly nicknamed the Ghost of 232. Meanwhile, the FAA overhauled its maintenance oversight programs. Titanium fan discs became subject to far more rigorous inspection standards, including ultrasonic testing, which could detect flaws invisible to older die techniques. No longer could a microscopic crack no bigger than the width of a pencil lead bring down a jet full of passengers. The memorial in Sioux City's serene riverside park, a curved wall of black granite, rises quietly from the earth. On it are etched 112 names. The Flight 232 Memorial, built in 1994, is not flashy. It is quiet, dignified, a place of reflection. Beneath the names is a quote from Captain Haynes: "We were not prepared for this, but we tried everything. We never gave up." Each July 19th, survivors, family members, first responders, and townspeople gather beneath the trees. Flowers are laid, names are read aloud, and for a few hours, time rewinds to that moment in 1989 when lives changed forever. Sioux City, once an anonymous dot on aviation maps, became synonymous with compassion, with courage, with community. As survivor Jan Brown said, "We crashed, but we didn't shatter. We carried each other through." Legacy, written in the skies. United Flight 232 remains one of the most studied aviation incidents in history, not because of how many died, but because of how many survived. In a cockpit with no hydraulics, in a plane ripped apart by physics and fate, 4 men turned chaos into a sliver of control. Dozens of passengers became rescuers. A town became a family, and a tragedy became a turning point. To this day, pilots still learn about United 232 during training. They read the CVR transcript. They study the throttle movements, the flight path, the crew communications. They memorize Haynes' words, Fitch's calculations, Record's coordination, Dvorak's quiet efficiency. What they are really learning, though, is something deeper than flight mechanics. They are learning about humanity, under pressure. About calm in crisis. About what it means to keep flying even when everything has failed. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all. You guys did a great job. You've done all you can do. No panic, no rage, just quiet admiration for a team that had performed the impossible. Those words, spoken into a black box surrounded by fire and wind, still echo decades later. United Airlines Flight 232 may have fallen, but it also soared, not in altitude, but in courage. In legacy. In the hearts of those who lived because someone refused to give up.